Imagine making dua against someone who wronged you, and watching the earth itself respond. Literally, a woman falsely accused Sa'id ibn Zayd of stealing her land. She brought witnesses. She lied in court. And Sa'id, standing there being slandered, made a simple dua. He said, "O Allah, if she is lying, then blind her sight and make her grave in her own land." And it happened. She went blind. And then while walking on that very land she claimed was hers, the earth opened beneath her, and she fell in, and the ground closed over her. She was buried alive by the land she tried to steal. This is not a legend. This is documented history, and this is the man whose dua had that kind of power, Sa'id ibn Zayd. But here's what makes Sa'id ibn Zayd different from the other 9 we've covered. You probably haven't heard much about him. He's the quiet one, the overlooked one. Abu Bakr led as the first caliph. Umar expanded the empire. Uthman and Ali are legendary. Talha, Zubayr, Abu Ubaidah, Abdul Rahman, Sa'd, all famous for something specific. But Sa'id? Sa'id was just there, at every major moment. One of the earliest believers, married to Umar's sister, helped convert Umar, fought in every battle, promised paradise, and yet rarely mentioned, not because he was less, but because he didn't seek attention, and that humility, that contentment with being in the background while Allah worked through him, that's what makes him special. This is the story of Sa'id ibn Zayd, the living miracle, the man whose dua literally moved mountains, one of the earliest believers in Islam, the husband of Umar's sister and the catalyst for Umar's conversion, a warrior who fought in every major battle, one of the 10 companions promised paradise by name, and the final companion in our series. This is where our journey ends, with the quiet giant, the overlooked hero, the man whose humility was as powerful as his dua. The 10th and final companion promised paradise, Sa'id ibn Zayd. This is part 10, the final episode of our series, Men and Women Around the Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. We've journeyed through all 10 companions promised paradise, from caliphs to warriors, merchants to archers, the trustworthy to the generous. And now we meet the last one, the humble one, the quiet miracle, Sa'id ibn Zayd, the companion who completes the 10, the man who closes this blessed circle. Let's honor him, and through him, complete our journey through the greatest generation that ever lived. Sa'id ibn Zayd was born into one of the most powerful families in Makkah. His clan, Banu Adi, was part of Quraysh's nobility. He had status. He had connections. He had everything the Meccan elite valued. And among his closest relatives was a young man named Umar ibn al-Khattab, his cousin, and later his brother-in-law. Sa'id and Umar grew up in the same circles, same tribe, same class, same worldview. But their lives were about to diverge dramatically, because Sa'id was about to hear a message that would change everything, and Umar wouldn't hear it until later. Sa'id would become one of the first believers, and one day he would help bring Umar to Islam.
And Sa'id wasn't just an early Muslim. He was among the very first. The sources say that Sa'id and Fatimah accepted Islam before the Prophet, even began teaching at al-Arqam, the famous house where Muslims would later gather. That means Sa'id was there at the absolute beginning, when Islam was just a handful of people, maybe 20, maybe 30, before Abu Bakr brought in his network. Before the mass conversions, Sa'id was already there, believing, practicing, and keeping it secret, because Quraysh hadn't yet realized how big this would become. They didn't know that this small group of early believers would one day transform the world. But Sa'id knew he'd found the truth, and he held on to it quietly, patiently, waiting for the day when Islam would emerge from the shadows.
So Sa'id and Fatimah's home became a secret place of worship. They would practice Islam behind closed doors, recite Quran quietly, pray when no one was watching. And sometimes, a teacher would come, Khabbab ibn al-Arat, one of the early Muslims, and he would teach them verses from the Quran. They would memorize them, study them, try to understand them, all in secret. Because if Umar found out, there would be consequences. Umar was violent in his opposition to Islam. He'd already beaten Muslims in the streets, and if he discovered that his own sister had betrayed the religion of their ancestors, that his brother-in-law had joined Muhammad's followers, who knows what he would do. So Sa'id and Fatimah kept their faith hidden and waited for the right moment. One day, Umar had had enough. He decided, I'm going to kill Muhammad and end this religion once and for all. He picked up his sword and started walking through Makkah, looking for the Prophet. People who saw him knew Umar is on a mission. And when Umar is on a mission, people die. But someone stopped him. A man named Nu'aym ibn Abdullah saw Umar with his sword and said, "Where are you going, Umar?" Umar said, "I'm going to kill Muhammad." And Nu'aym, who was secretly Muslim himself, made a quick decision. He said, "Before you do that, maybe you should take care of your own house. Your sister and her husband have become Muslims." And Umar froze. His sister? Fatimah? Muslim? That couldn't be true. But he turned, and instead of going to find Muhammad, Umar went to his sister's house. When Umar arrived at the house, he heard something. Voices. Recitation. Quran being read. He burst through the door. Khabbab, who had been teaching them, quickly hid. And Umar saw Sa'id and Fatimah, and he knew immediately. They were Muslims. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Have you joined Muhammad?" And here's where Sa'id and Fatimah showed their courage. They could have lied. They could have denied it. But Fatimah looked at her brother, this violent, dangerous man, and she said, "Yes, Umar, we are Muslims, and we will not leave Islam no matter what you do." And Umar, in his rage, struck her, his own sister. He hit her across the face. Blood ran down her cheek. But Fatimah didn't break. She stood there bleeding and repeated, "Yes, we are Muslims. Do what you want." And Sa'id stood with her, not fighting, but not backing down either. And then something shifted. Umar looked at his sister, bleeding, defiant, willing to die for what she believed. And maybe for the first time, he saw the strength of this faith. He noticed the manuscript they'd been reading, the Quran, and he said, "Show me what you were reciting." Fatimah, even bleeding, said, "You have to purify yourself first." So Umar washed, and then he took the manuscript. And he read, Surah Taha, Taha, "We have not sent down the Quran to you to cause you distress, but only as a reminder for those who fear Allah." And as Umar read, his heart changed, the rage melted, the hatred softened. And he said something that Sa'id and Fatimah could barely believe. "This is not the word of a human. Take me to Muhammad." Sa'id and Fatimah looked at each other. Had it worked? Had Allah just changed Umar's heart? Through their courage? Through their faith? So Sa'id took Umar to the Prophet. And when they arrived at Dar al-Arqam, where Muslims were gathered, there was panic. People saw Umar with his sword and thought, "He's here to kill us." But Sa'id said, "No, he wants to meet the Prophet." And the Prophet Muhammad came out. He saw Umar, and he welcomed him. And Umar ibn al-Khattab, the man who had terrified Muslims for years, spoke the Shahada, "La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah." There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Umar became Muslim, and Islam gained its fiercest defender. The man who was going to kill the Prophet became the man who would die, protecting Islam. And it started in Sa'id's house, with Sa'id and Fatimah's courage, with their hidden faith made public, with their willingness to stand firm even when Umar struck them. That's what changed Umar. And through Umar, Islam changed forever. After Umar's conversion, everything changed for Sa'id and Fatimah. They didn't have to hide anymore. Umar made his Islam public. He prayed at the Kaaba openly, and no one dared touch him. The same man who had terrified Muslims now protected them. And Sa'id? Sa'id went back to being quiet. While Umar became the public face of Islam's strength, Sa'id remained in the background. He didn't need recognition. He'd done what mattered. He'd stayed faithful when it was dangerous. He'd stood with his wife when Umar struck her. He'd kept Islam alive in his home. And when the moment came, his household became the turning point for Islam's future. That was enough for Sa'id. He didn't need more. Umar could have the spotlight. Sa'id was content to serve in the shadows. Sa'id and Fatimah went with them. They left Makkah behind, the city where they'd hidden their faith, where they'd faced Umar's rage, where they'd witnessed his conversion, and they settled in Medina. The Prophet established the Islamic State, and Sa'id became part of it, not as a leader, not as a commander, but as a soldier, a servant, a believer ready to do whatever Islam needed. The quiet giant, the overlooked hero, about to prove his worth on the battlefield, and in his du'as, because Sa'id ibn Zayd's greatest moments were still to come. Uhud Sa'id was there. The trench Sa'id was there. Khaybar Sa'id was there. He missed Badr because he was on a mission for the Prophet elsewhere. But every other major battle, every significant expedition, Sa'id showed up. He fought bravely. He risked his life. He bled for Islam. But the sources don't tell dramatic stories about Sa'id in battle. Why? Because he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just doing his job, fighting when needed, serving when called, and then going home. No boasting, no stories, no seeking fame, just quiet, consistent, faithful service. Battle after battle, year after year. That was Sa'id ibn Zayd. And one day, the Prophet Muhammad was sitting in a garden with 10 of his companions, and he named them one by one. Abu Bakr is in paradise. Umar is in paradise. Uthman is in paradise. Ali is in paradise. Talha is in paradise. Zubair is in paradise. Abu Ubaidah is in paradise. Abdurrahman is in paradise. Saad is in paradise. And then he said, Sa'id ibn Zayd is in paradise, the 10th name, the final promise. And Sa'id ibn Zayd was guaranteed paradise while he was still alive, still walking the earth, still serving in the background. He'd done nothing to seek this honor. He hadn't demanded it, hadn't worked for recognition. He'd just been faithful, quietly, consistently. And Allah saw, and the Prophet recognized, and paradise was promised. To the quiet one, to the humble one, to Sa'id. Sa'id lived through every caliphate. Abu Bakr became caliph, Sa'id served him. Umar became caliph, Sa'id served his own brother-in-law. Uthman became caliph, Sa'id served him. Ali became caliph and the Ummah split. And through all of it, Sa'id remained steady. He didn't get involved in politics. He didn't take sides in disputes. He didn't seek position or power. He just served. Whoever was leading, Sa'id supported them as long as they led. According to Islam, he wasn't looking for glory. He was looking to serve Allah. And that service looked the same. Whether Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman or Ali was in charge. Faithful, quiet, consistent. That was Sa'id's way. Years later, when Sa'id was an old man, a woman named Arwa bint Aus came forward with a claim. She said that Sa'id had stolen part of her land, that he'd taken property that belonged to her, and she brought witnesses, false witnesses who testified against him. Sa'id stood in court, accused of theft. Him, one of the 10 promised paradise, a man who had been Muslim since the beginning, who had fought in every battle, who had never sought anything for himself. And now this woman was lying about him, slandering him, trying to take from him through deception what she couldn't take through truth. Sa'id could have fought back with arguments, with counter-witnesses, with legal maneuvering, but instead he did something else. He turned to Allah, and he made a dua. Sa'id raised his hands and said, "O Allah, if this woman is lying about me, if she is falsely claiming this land, then blind her sight, and make her grave in the very land she is lying about." It was a public dua. Everyone in that court heard it. And it wasn't said in anger. It was said in absolute certainty. Sa'id was saying, Allah, you know the truth. I'm leaving this to you. If she's lying, deal with her. If I'm wrong, deal with me. But you know what happened. So you judge. And everyone who heard that dua knew. This man is putting everything on the line. Because if he's lying and she's telling the truth, this dua will backfire on him. But Sa'id wasn't worried. Because he knew the truth. And he knew Allah knew it too. And then it started happening. Arwa began losing her sight. Her vision blurred, then darkened. She went to physicians, healers. No one could help her. And eventually she went completely blind. Total darkness. And people remembered. Sa'id had prayed that if she was lying, Allah would blind her sight. And it had happened. The first part of the dua was fulfilled. And everyone who knew about the case started to realize, something is happening here. This isn't coincidence. This is Allah responding to Sa'id's prayer. The man whose dua moved earth was showing his power. And this was just the beginning. And then came the second part. Arwa, now blind, was walking on that very land. The land she'd claimed was hers, the land she'd lied about. And as she walked, the earth beneath her opened. Not an earthquake, not a sinkhole that was already there. The ground literally opened beneath her feet, and she fell in. And the earth collapsed around her. People nearby tried to help. They ran toward her. But the earth kept caving in, filling in the hole, burying her. And they couldn't stop it. Arwa bint Aus was buried alive, in the land she had lied about, exactly as Sa'id had prayed. Make her grave in this land. And Allah did. The woman who tried to take Sa'id's property through false testimony died in that very property, buried by it, consumed by it. The earth itself became her grave, and everyone who witnessed it knew Sa'id ibn Zayd's dua had power, real, physical, undeniable power. This story is narrated in authentic sources. It's documented history, and the scholars who narrate it say, this is what happens when you bear false witness. This is what happens when you lie about the righteous. This is what happens when you try to take what doesn't belong to you through deception. Allah sees, Allah knows, and Allah responds. And Sa'id's dua was answered because Sa'id was truthful, because he was righteous, because his life had been spent in service to Allah, and when he called upon Allah for justice, Allah gave it to him in the most visible, undeniable way possible. This wasn't just about land. This was about truth. This was Allah showing, I protect my servants. I answer their prayers, and I deal with those who wrong them. The earth itself testified to Sa'id's truthfulness, and everyone who heard this story learned, don't wrong the righteous, because their du'as reach Allah. And when Allah responds, it's perfect. And Sa'id? How did he respond to this miracle? Did he boast about it? Did he tell everyone, see, I was right. Allah proved it? No, because that's not who Sa'id was. He'd made the dua not to show off his power with Allah, but to seek justice, to reveal truth. And when the truth was revealed in such a dramatic, terrifying way, Sa'id didn't celebrate. He was sobered by it, because this was divine justice, and divine justice is serious. A woman had died because she lied about him. That's not something to celebrate. It's something to fear, to respect. Sa'id thanked Allah for vindicating him, but he didn't change. He remained the same humble, quiet, faithful servant he'd always been. The miracle didn't make him proud. It made him more aware of Allah's power, and more committed to staying on the path of truth. This is why we call Sa'id the living miracle, because his dua didn't just change hearts, it moved earth. Literally. The ground opened because Sa'id prayed. The soil swallowed a woman because Sa'id called upon Allah for justice. That's not metaphorical. That's physical. That's real. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas shot arrows that never missed. Abu Ubaidah gave his teeth for the Prophet. Abdurrahman built fortunes. And Sa'id? Sa'id's du'as moved creation itself. The earth, this solid, stable, unmoving earth, responded to his words. Because when a righteous person speaks to Allah, and Allah chooses to answer in a visible way, creation obeys. That's the power of a life lived for Allah. That's what happens when you're truthful, humble, and faithful for decades. Your du'as carry weight, not just spiritual weight, physical weight, enough to move mountains, enough to open earth, enough to manifest divine justice in the most undeniable way possible. In his old age, Sa'id ibn Zayd became what few people ever become, a living witness to history. He'd been there from the beginning, before Dar al-Arqam, before Abu Bakr brought in his network, before Umar converted. He'd been one of the first Muslims, and now, in his 70s or 80s, he was one of the last original companions still alive. The young Muslims in Medina would come to him and ask, what was it like when Islam was new, when you had to hide, when Umar was still against us? Daivi and Sa'id would tell them, patiently, humbly, not making himself the hero, just telling the truth. We hid our faith. We feared for our lives, but we believed, and Allah protected us. And look what Islam became. And they would look around at the mosques, The empire. The millions of Muslims, and they would understand. It started with people like Sa'id. Quiet, faithful, hidden, but real. Sa'id ibn Zayd died around the year 50 or 51 after Hijrah. Some sources say he was the last of the 10 promised paradise to die. Others say Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas died slightly after him. Either way, Sa'id lived a very long life, long enough to see Islam grow from a handful of secret believers to an empire spanning continents, long enough to see Makkah, the city, where he'd hidden his faith, become the center of the Muslim world, long enough to witness his brother-in-law, Umar, go from trying to kill the Prophet to being one of the greatest caliphs in history. Sa'id had seen it all, and now his time was complete. He died the way he'd lived, quietly, peacefully, with faith. No drama, no seeking attention even in death. He was promised paradise decades earlier, and now he was going to claim it. They buried Sa'id ibn Zayd in Baqi Cemetery in Medina, near the other companions. The funeral was large. People came to honor one of the 10 promised paradise. But it probably wasn't the massive event that Umar's or Ali's funerals had been, because Sa'id hadn't lived his life in the spotlight. He'd lived it in the background. And so even in death, he didn't draw the crowds that others did. But the people who came knew what they were losing. They were losing a living link to the Prophet, a witness to Islam's earliest days, a man whose dua had moved the earth, one of the 10 promised paradise, the quiet giant, the overlooked hero. And as they lowered him into the ground, they knew an era was ending. The generation that walked with the Prophet was almost gone, and the world would never see their like again. So what made Sa'id ibn Zayd different from the other 9? Abu Bakr led the Ummah. Omar expanded it. Uthman supported it with wealth. Ali was the scholar. Talha was the living martyr. Zubair was the disciple. Abu Ubaidah was the trustworthy one. Abdurrahman was the generous merchant. Sa'd was the answered prayer with the arrows. And Sa'id? Sa'id was the quiet one, the one most people don't know much about. But here's what makes him special. He was there for everything. Everything. One of the first to believe. The catalyst for Umar's conversion. Fighter in every battle. Promised paradise. The man whose dua moved earth. And through it all, he never sought the spotlight. He could have made himself famous. He was Umar's brother-in-law. He could have leveraged that. But he didn't. He stayed humble, stayed quiet, and let his actions and his duas speak for him. Here's what we learn from Sa'id about humility. Real greatness doesn't need to announce itself. Sa'id had every reason to be famous. He was one of the first Muslims. He helped convert Umar ibn al-Khattab. His dua literally moved the earth. He was promised paradise, but he never made any of that about himself. He never wrote his own story. He never demanded recognition. He just served, quietly, faithfully, for decades. And the lesson for us is this. You don't need people to know how great you are. You need Allah to know. Sa'id could have died completely unknown to us, and he still would have gone to paradise, because his reward wasn't in this world's recognition. It was in Allah's pleasure. And that's the test. Can you serve Allah even if no one ever knows? Can you be faithful even if you're overlooked? Can you do the right thing even when no one's watching? Sa'id could, and that's what made him great. The second lesson is about dua. Sa'id's prayer literally moved the earth. But that's not the lesson. The lesson is this. When you live a righteous life, when you dedicate yourself to Allah, when you're truthful and humble and faithful, your duas carry weight. Not everyone's dua will cause miracles like Sa'id's did. But everyone's dua reaches Allah. And when you've lived your life for Allah, when you call upon Him, He responds. Maybe not with miracles, maybe not immediately, but He responds. Sa'id's dua was answered in the most dramatic way because Sa'id had been faithful for 50 years, since before al-Arqam, since Makkah, since the beginning. His whole life testified to his sincerity. So when he made dua, Allah answered in a way that testified to His righteousness. Your dua might not move earth, but if you're sincere, it will move heaven. And that's what matters. The third lesson is about being early to truth. Sa'id accepted Islam before it was safe, before it was popular, before most people had even heard of it. He was one of the first. And that required courage, because early believers don't have the security of numbers. They don't have the support of community. They don't have proof that it's going to work out. They just have faith. And Sa'id had that faith. He heard the message, recognized the truth, and committed even though it meant hiding from Quraysh, even though it meant risking Umar's rage, even though it meant potential death. He was early, and early believers pay a price. But they also get a blessing. They're closer to the source, closer to the Prophet, closer to the purity of the message, and Sa'id had that. He was there at the beginning, and that made him special. If you're young and listening to this, be like Sa'id. Don't wait for people to recognize you before you do great things. Don't need validation from the world to serve Allah. Do the right thing even if no one sees it. Stand for truth even if you're early and alone. Make dua with absolute sincerity, trusting that Allah hears you and will respond in His perfect way. Sa'id shows us that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who serve without seeking recognition, those are often the most powerful, because their power comes from Allah, not from people's applause. So serve quietly, believe strongly, pray sincerely, and trust that even if the whole world overlooks you, Allah sees. And that's all that matters. And with Sa'id ibn Zayd, we complete our journey. 10 companions, 10 stories, 10 lives dedicated to Allah and His Messenger. We started with Abu Bakr, the truthful friend who never doubted. We met Umar, the fierce warrior who became the just caliph. We honored Uthman, the generous one who supported Islam with his wealth. We walked with Ali, the lion of Allah, the scholar and warrior. We witnessed Talha, the living martyr who took arrows for the Prophet. We followed Zubair, the disciple who was family and fighter. We admired Abu Ubaidah, the trustworthy one who gave his teeth for the Prophet. We learned from Abdurrahman, the generous merchant who gave away fortunes. We aimed with Saad, whose arrows never missed, and whose prayers were always answered. And we've concluded with Sa'id, the quiet giant whose dua moved the earth. 10 men, 10 promises of paradise, 10 examples for us to follow. And here's what all 10 of them had in common. They put Allah first. Before family, before tribe, before wealth, before their own lives, Allah came first. They loved the Prophet with a love that's hard for us to imagine. They would have died for him. Some of them nearly did. They sacrificed everything. Wealth, comfort, status, family approval, all of it. They served more than they took. They gave more than they received. They fought when needed, and they built when called. They were humble despite being great. They were promised paradise but never stopped working. And they all show us. This is what a life for Allah looks like. Different personalities, different roles, different stories, but the same core. Faith, love, sacrifice, service, humility. That's the pattern. That's what made them the 10. And that's what we're called to follow. So here's the question for you. Will you be like them? You're not going to be promised paradise by name in this life that was their special blessing. You're not going to walk with the Prophet, they had that honor. But you can live like they lived. You can put Allah first like Abu Bakr. You can be just and strong like Umar. You can be generous like Uthman and Abdurrahman. You can seek knowledge like Ali. You can sacrifice like Talha and Zubair. You can be trustworthy like Abu Ubaidah. You can make dua with faith like Saad and Sa'id. You can be humble in your service, early to truth, faithful through trials. You can be all of those things. The question is, will you? These 10 showed us it's possible. They were human like us. They had fears, doubts, struggles. But they chose Allah, and they never stopped choosing Allah until the day they died and entered the paradise they were promised. That's the challenge. That's the call. Will you answer it? Thank you for journeying with us through these 10 blessed lives. From Abu Bakr to Sa'id ibn Zayd, from the truthful friend to the living miracle, we've witnessed sacrifice and service, humility and heroism, wealth given away and lives laid down, prayers answered and battles won. And through it all, we've seen what it means to live for Allah and His Messenger. May Allah be pleased with all 10 of them. May we follow their examples. May we live with their faith, their love, their sacrifice, their service, their humility, and may Allah grant us what He granted them, paradise, Not because we're perfect, but because we never stopped trying, because we never stopped choosing Allah, because we lived and died as Muslims. That's their legacy. That's their gift to us. And that's our path forward. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.